Hello, everyone. My name is Miss Lutz, and I'm very excited to be here to teach you a little bit today. I wish that I could be with you in person, but unfortunately, due to circumstances, this is where we're at. I want to tell you a little bit about myself before we get into the lesson, and then I hope to learn a little bit about you as well. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then I went to Grove City College and I studied politics and history. And then since I loved politics so much, I went and studied more at George Mason University in Virginia. And I am very close to being finished there, and I will be moving back here, which I am super excited about. Now, to learn more about you, I have two questions for you on your worksheet. The first one is, who is your favorite saint? And I know this can be hard to pick one, so if you have a few, feel free to list them and tell me just a little bit about them, why you like them, something you like about them. I am a new Catholic. I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary. Yay. So I'm always looking to learn about new saints. So maybe you can teach me something as well. And then the second question is going to be, who is your favorite president? I know you haven't learned about all of the presidents, but perhaps you have one. So my favorite saint is Saint Teresa of Calcutta, aka Mother Teresa. She's my favorite saint because I love how she loves. And my favorite president is President Lincoln. I hope that you get to learn about him this school year, but if not, you will absolutely learn about him eventually. So today we're going to learn about a different president, though. And this president is Thomas Jefferson. So I know that you probably talked about him in class a good bit, but we're going to even talk about him more because Jefferson is a very important figure in U.S. history. He is a complicated character, and he's also a debated figure. His writings, his thoughts are quite debated. So we're going to get into some of those topics today. But here he is. He was born April 2nd, 1743 in Virginia. He died on July 4th, 1826. So this is a pretty cool thing. So there's two things that are significant about his death. The first one is quite obvious. The creator of the Declaration of Independence dies on the day that we celebrate the United States independence. Another fact is that John Adams died on the same day. And this is famously quote. There's a famous quote that John Adams said before he died. So Jefferson and Adams were one of the few founders left that were still alive. So Adams, on his deathbed, said, "Oh, at least we still have Thomas Jefferson." But unfortunately, he didn't know that Thomas Jefferson had died. I think it was 5 to 4 hours earlier. So they both died on July 4th, and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were actually great friends. I have this book, but I don't have it with me here in Pittsburgh. But it's about this thick. It's a pretty big book, and it's all the letters from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They were pen pals for many, many, many years, and they talked about many different topics. You can learn a lot about them by reading these letters, but you also learned about the 1800 election, which was super contested, nasty, right? And Jefferson ends up beating John Adams, as you know, and their friendship fell apart after this for obvious reasons, and they didn't write to each other for a while. And Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, brought them back together. So that's a little side note on them. He was married, he had 6 kids. He was a lawyer, a farmer, a politician. You could also put down there that he was a political philosopher in many ways. Religiously, he was a Christian deist. So that means that he didn't believe in miracles or Jesus's divinity. So he famously has this Jefferson's Bible where he took out the miracles in the Bible, and I think he took out a few books. You can see this at his estate here, Monticello in Virginia. I believe it's there. You can tour his estate. You can see some of his rooms. I've never been there, but I want to go. It's on my bucket list. So maybe you can put it on your bucket list and go visit someday. Some of the offices he held, he was governor of Virginia. He was the first Secretary of State. And he also was, of course, president. There are other political offices that he held, but we're not going to get into those today. Okay, so we're going to touch on 2 of his writings and thoughts on both of these subjects. I picked these because within each of them, there are debates on Jefferson's thoughts on his writings. So we're going to try and tease it out a bit. Okay, so the first one is slavery. We're going to talk about that. So Jefferson owned 600 slaves in his life. He did free some in his will, but only a small amount. He had trouble with the institution of slavery itself, and you can really see this in his writings. As he got older, especially, as you can see, this letter is 1820, he talked more about the need to end the institution of slavery in some way, to chip away at it, to slow it down, something. He has a famous quote, which I actually found in 2 writings, and I'm going to have you read this letter where the quote comes from, because in the letter, you really can see how Jefferson struggled with slavery and how he wanted it to end. He not in this letter, but he called it a hideous blot in US history. So he acknowledged that this was not good for the country. So in this quote, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. So what does this mean? The wolf is, of course, slavery, the institution of slavery. So he's saying that we have this institution and we're holding on to it, but we can't hold on to him forever, right? We can't. Well, why can't we? He says that justice is in one scale, right? We can't hold on to slavery as an institution because it's morally wrong. It is corrupting society, and he knows that. And he says, but we can't safely let him go. So many of the founders related to Jefferson in this sense. They knew that slavery was wrong, the institution was wrong, and they wanted to find a way to eliminate it in some sense, right? Chip away at it. But they couldn't figure out how to do this because they were afraid of 2 things. One, they were afraid of economic consequences, what would happen to the economy, right? The country, some states relied on slavery economically. And the other fear was that there would be bloodshed, that there would be uprising between African Americans and whites in particular. Now, we know that there was, in fact, bloodshed over the emancipation of slaves, right? The Civil War happened, but it wasn't between, right, African Americans and whites. It was between the South and the North. So Jefferson was right in a sense, but it was more so with um, the freed people, right, than the slaves versus the freed people. So I'm going to have you read that letter so that you can understand Jefferson a bit more. But while Jefferson was a advocate of trying to end the institution of slavery, he also had writings that were racist. So we have notes on the state of Virginia. So in this writing, it's pretty long. He is comparing African Americans to whites as well as Native Americans. And he concludes that whites are superior to African Americans in some instances, as well as Native Americans. This is clearly a racist thought. And you see this in Jefferson's writings, which is why some people, right, debate Jefferson, because they say, oh, Jefferson was racist, Jefferson owned slaves, but we have to acknowledge the fact, right, that Jefferson spoke against the institution of slavery and yet still had racist beliefs and was fearful of ending slavery. But as president, he did get to do something he thought that would help chip away at the institution of slavery. So we see in our Constitution that the founders actually put in a clause to end the slave, to allow Congress to end the slave trade. So it says in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution stated that Congress could not prohibit the importation of persons prior to 1808. Now, I don't know why they picked this date in particular, but you see that Congress wasn't allowed to prohibit the slave trade until before 1808, sorry. So 20 years later, the act to prohibit the importation of slaves in any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from and after the first day of January 1808 was passed. So 20 years after the Constitution was written, this was passed. Jefferson was president at the time. He advocated for Congress to pass a bill to end the slave trade in 1806. And we can see his address down here. He says, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, and which the morality, the reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to prescribe. So we see a couple things in this speech, right? We see one, that Jefferson believed that importing people from Africa to then sell them as slaves was a human rights violation. That is a loaded statement. That is a big statement. And then he also says that it's in the best interest of the country, right, to end the slave trade. So we see that he really was trying to end this act, to end this human rights violation to African Americans. So he signs this in 1807, and it gets becomes law in January 1st, 1808, as soon as it can. But unfortunately, this did not end slavery. This did not even slow slavery down, quite frankly. It led to other horrible consequences, which we're not going to talk about, but he tried to help the situation, but instead, unfortunately, it did not. And we see that it wasn't until 1865 that slavery was illegal. Okay, so the next topic is Jefferson on religious freedom. So he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786. Madison used this as a blueprint to writing the First Amendment. The statute argued for religious liberty and freedom of conscience. Jefferson really cared about this topic, as you can see in this quote. It says, "The constitutional freedom of religion is the most inalienable and sacred of all human rights." So Jefferson held religious freedom to very high, was very high up on his human rights. He thought that this was one of the most important rights, and you see this in a lot of his writings. And this is just a quote from that statute. He says, "Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free." So we see in that sentence, he is advocating that we were born, right, with freedom of conscience, that all attempts to influence it lead to hypocrisy and meanness and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. So he's arguing that he believes God has given us free will to decide whether we will follow him or not. We too should give people free will to choose which religion, right? The government should not coerce or force people to believe in one religion. So that's what Jefferson is arguing. That is why he believes in religious liberty and freedom of conscience. But then we have this very famous line found in one of the letters to the Danbury Baptists that Jefferson wrote when he was president. So to give some context here, the Danbury Baptist Association wrote to Jefferson in 1801 expressing their concerns about religious freedom. They were being persecuted in the state of Connecticut. Connecticut had established a religion. It was the Congregationalists, and different states had established religions at the time, which you may have known. And so Jefferson was responding to them. He was assuring them that they would have religious liberty. So he says, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislators should make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So this phrase, the last phrase, building a wall of separation between church and state, was used throughout American history, is still used today to either advocate for freedom of religion or to help get rid of religion in certain areas. So you can think here, public schools, right? Prayer in public places. Both sides will use this line. What Jefferson meant by building a wall of separation between church and state is debated. Whether he was talking about assuring the Danbury Baptists that the federal government would not establish a religion, that the federal government would not hinder their religious liberty, is one argument. Another argument is that he was broadly broadly stating his belief that there shouldn't be an establishment of religion in any type of government, right? Whether that's federal or state. But regardless, really, of what he was saying about the wall of separation, what's more important here is that Jefferson was assuring the Baptists, right, that they would have freedom of religion. They would be able to exercise their religion, that the government can't prohibit this on any level. So this is significant, right? This is reaffirming his belief in religious liberty it's not so much saying that, religion can't be in the public square. We don't really get that from this writing. But people have used this writing to argue that religion should be taken out of government, should be taken out of schools, etc. Anything public. So these are a list of court cases that have either used that phrase to advance religious freedom or to hinder religious freedom. I forget if I stated this, but the phrase wall of separation between church and state is not in the Constitution. Many people believe that it is in the Constitution, but it is not. It's just been used so much by the Supreme Court that many people think that it is in the Constitution, but it's not. Okay. Another debate that we're going to talk about now is the debate on the Neutrality Proclamation. This was between Hamilton and Madison. So I know that you all have been talking about political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. These debates are a great way to kind of see the differences between the two parties forming at the time. Here's a picture of those debates. It was really between Hamilton and Madison. So we will talk about the context of the Neutrality Proclamation. It was signed in 1793. So Washington was president at the time, and England and France were at war. Washington had to make a decision on what to do because we were a young country, right? Just starting out, literally. He did not believe that we were in a position to help either country, and he wanted to stay out of it. So he asked his cabinet, what should I do? And his cabinet agreed that he should stay out of it. And so he declared neutrality, which just means he remained neutral, right? He didn't pick a side. And a debate followed because he did this on his own. He did not get it approved by Congress. So the debate around the Neutrality Proclamation is on whether the executive branch had the power to do this on its own without congressional approval. This debate is still going on today. There is no right or wrong side to this. The courts didn't say, oh, Washington was right or Washington's act was unconstitutional. Nothing like that. It was just kind of a debate on the executive powers and what the president can or cannot do with foreign relations when dealing with other countries. Okay, so Hamilton is disguised under this name, Pacificus. I might have said that wrong, but he used this name. And he argues that Washington had the constitutional authority to declare neutrality. So this is a quick summary on why he believed that. But if you remember from reading some of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton wrote a lot on the executive branch, and Madison wrote a lot on the legislative branch. So you see that, interestingly enough, in these debates, Hamilton is advocating for a strong executive, and Madison is arguing that the legislative branch should have been involved in this neutrality proclamation. So it's kind of interesting and fitting. So Hamilton argues that the executive is the organ of powers to do so. So this means that he's saying that the organ, right, or the branch of government that has the powers to declare neutrality is the executive. Why? He goes through the different organs, to use his language. He says Congress is not charged with making nor interpreting treaties. Right? The executive does. The executive negotiates treaties. He says it's not the judiciary because they decide litigations and cases, right? This is not a case. This hasn't been brought to the courts. And he says that it has to be the executive because the president, one, talks with foreign countries and interprets treaties and executes, right? So there's two powers in there. One is the president negotiates treaties, he talks to other countries, and the other power is the president's role, right? He's the executive branch. He executes things. So he's saying that the president, after negotiating with foreign countries, has to then follow through. So he says that this is really where the crux of the argument is in. He argues that there is a vesting clause found in Article 2 of the Constitution with the president. And the vesting clause gives the president implied powers. So this is different from enumerated powers, which you may have learned about, right? The enumerated powers are those powers that are listed out specifically in the Constitution. So we can think here in Article 1, Congress has powers herein granted, right? And then they are listed out. Those are the enumerated powers. So the executive branch, we look at Article 2, has some enumerated powers within it, but not all of them, Hamilton argues, are enumerated. So Hamilton's going back, if we go back to the Federalist Papers, right, Hamilton talks a lot about the nature of the executive when they're discussing why they need one executive, right? This was a big debate in the Constitutional Convention to have 3 presidents or 1 president. Part of the argument, Hamilton argues, is that the president needs to have a certain nature. He needs to be able to execute quickly, sometimes do things secretively, and this is why. When dealing with international relations, Hamilton argues the president has to have these 2 characteristics because other countries can't know what's going on, right? So that's Hamilton's argument. He also concludes that the executive has a duty to preserve peace, right? When there's not war, there's peace. So the executive has this duty, he says, to keep the peace while Congress has the duty to declare war. So Madison's pen name is Helvidius, and Madison does not want to get involved at first. Jefferson, yes, he's back, persuaded Madison to write a response to Hamilton. Jefferson and Hamilton, they have very different political thoughts. They often got in disagreements when it came to executive powers, especially. And so Jefferson goes to Madison, asks him to write a response. He says he would be the best person to do so. Madison hesitantly says yes, and Madison simply argues that this is a treaty, and since it's a treaty, Congress has to approve it. So he says that the president executes laws. The president doesn't make laws, right? Congress makes laws. So therefore, because the president is making law, right, he's making this treaty, he says that the executive is taking on powers that are found in the legislative branch. He also disagrees with Hamilton on implied powers. Madison says that Article 2 has powers that are enumerated, right, that are listed, and he goes through those in this debate, and he notes there is no power, right, to declare neutrality. If anything, right, Congress has the power to declare war. Therefore, Congress also has the power to declare neutrality. that's where Madison falls. So it's the exact opposite, basically, of Hamilton. And this debate ends with really no clear winner. The winner really is Washington because the Neutrality Proclamation stayed and the courts didn't get involved. So there really is no winner, though, in terms of who's right on the executive powers. So I'm going to ask you all, since you have studied now the branches of government, you understand their powers, I'm going to ask you who you think made the better argument. Was it Madison or Hamilton? And don't feel like there's a right answer here, because I just want to see what you have learned when it comes to the different powers of branches. And you can use everything that you've learned so far to make your little argument as to why Madison or Hamilton is correct. Okay. So in conclusion to this, Jefferson resigns. He thinks that we are offending France. We're turning our back on France. So he can no longer be Secretary of State, and he leaves. So that's how that ends. And our lesson is over. So if you have any questions, I believe that you can ask them on the Google Classroom, hopefully. I will be able to respond, hopefully. So feel free to ask me any questions you have on Jefferson. If you want maybe more information on anything, I can get you that. If you have any questions on the debate, right? Anything we went over. I'm going to have you read both of those letters that Jefferson wrote because they're historically important. They're really short, and the language in them might be a little difficult, but I think you'll be fine since we went over both of them. I just want you to see the different arguments in them that Jefferson makes, since they are very important. And then, yeah, you'll have to answer questions on a worksheet. And that's all I have for you. So I thank you very much for listening. And I hope that you learned something interesting today. It was great to teach you about some U.S. history. And I hope that you have a great rest of your school year and a great summer, and stay safe. All right. Bye, everyone.